Hello guys. Welcome to our channel. Today we are going to cover the topic the rise and fall of the Persian Empire versus Greece. It is a narrow ribbon of water that for millennia has served as the threshold between two worlds. In the early 5th century before Christ, the earth seemed to groan under the weight of a march that would change the course of history forever. From the gilded heartlands of the East, the Persian Empire, a multi-ethnic colossus stretching from the Indus to the Nile, turned its gaze toward the rocky extremities of the West. There lay Greece, a fractured landscape of independent city-states, often at each other's throats, yet bound by a shared tongue and a mythic past. At the center of this defiance stood Sparta, a society forged in iron and indoctrinated by a singular, brutal purpose. This was more than a conflict of borders. It was a collision of worlds. This is the epic account of the ancient wars between Greeks and Persians. To understand the clash of civilizations that would one day stain the sands of Marathon and the mountain passes of Thermopylae, we must first turn our gaze away from the rocky shores of the Aegean. We must travel east, across the vast stretches of Anatolia and the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, to a world that was already ancient when the Greek city-states were still in their infancy. Here, amidst the dusty plains and towering peaks of the Iranian plateau, a power was stirring that would soon dwarf every kingdom the world had ever known. This was the dawn of the Achaemenid Empire, a colossus born from the vision of one man and the iron will of a people who believed they were chosen by the gods to rule the four corners of the earth. In the mid-6th century before Christ, the dominant power in the region was the Median Empire, a sophisticated and warlike realm that held sway over much of modern-day Iran and eastern Turkey. To the south, in the rugged province of Persis, the Persians lived as vassals to the Median kings. But in the year 550 before Christ, a young prince named Cyrus, later to be known as Cyrus the Great, led a daring revolt against his grandfather, the Median king Astyages. It was a pivotal moment in human history. Within a few short years, the tables had turned. The Medes were incorporated into a new, burgeoning Persian state, and Cyrus stood at the head of a military machine that was only just beginning to find its strength. But Cyrus was not merely a conqueror. He was a visionary who understood that an empire built solely on blood and terror would eventually consume itself. As he marched his armies across the Near East, he brought with him a new philosophy of governance. Instead of razing cities to the ground and enslaving their populations in the manner of the Assyrians of old, Cyrus often chose a path of relative tolerance. He allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religions, their customs, and their local administrators, provided they acknowledged him as the supreme king of kings and paid their taxes into the royal treasury. It was a strategy of inclusion that turned former enemies into loyal subjects, and it allowed the Persian borders to expand with a speed that left the rest of the civilized world in a state of shock. By the year 547 before Christ, the Persian juggernaut reached the borders of the Lydian Empire in western Anatolia. This was the realm of King Croesus, a man whose name was synonymous with unimaginable wealth. The Lydians were a proud and powerful people, and Croesus, feeling the pressure of the Persian advance, sought the advice of the oracle at Delphi in Greece. The oracle, in its typically cryptic fashion, told him that if he crossed the river Halys to attack the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged by what he thought was a divine blessing, Croesus led his forces into battle. He did indeed destroy a great empire, but to his horror, it was his own. The fall of the Lydian capital of Sardis in 546 before Christ was a seismic event that brought the Persian Empire into direct contact with the Greek world for the first time. Along the western coast of Anatolia lay the Ionian Greek cities, wealthy maritime hubs like Miletus, Ephesus, and Phocia. For generations, these cities had existed in a state of uneasy coexistence with the Lydians, paying tribute but maintaining their unique Hellenic culture. Now, they found themselves staring into the eyes of a new master, one who demanded total submission. It was during this time that a curious delegation arrived at the court of Cyrus the Great. They were Spartans, coming from the distant Peloponnese to warn the Persian king against harming any Greek city. The historian Herodotus tells us that Cyrus, having never heard of these people, turned to his advisors and asked a question that would echo through the centuries. Who are the Spartans? To the King of Kings, who had already subdued Babylon and Assyria and the greatest cities of the East, this small band of warriors from a tiny, peripheral corner of the world must have seemed entirely insignificant. He laughed at their arrogance, telling the messengers that he would soon give them something to worry about in their own land. But the seed of conflict had been sown. The shadow of the Achaemenids was beginning to stretch across the sea. Following the death of Cyrus on the eastern frontier, his son Cambyses expanded the empire even further, adding the ancient and mysterious land of Egypt to the Persian crown. But it was under the reign of Darius the Great, who took the throne in 522 before Christ, that the empire reached its administrative and territorial zenith. Darius was a master organizer, a king who understood that communication and logistics were as important as the spear and the bow. He divided his vast domains into 20 provinces, or satrapies, each governed by a hand-picked official who answered directly to the throne. To bind this gargantuan realm together, Darius commissioned the construction of the Royal Road, a marvel of ancient engineering stretching over 1,500 miles from the heart of Persia to the city of Sardis in the west. Along this road, royal messengers on horseback could travel from one end of the empire to the other in less than a week, a feat of speed that was unheard of in the ancient world. Darius also introduced a standardized currency, the gold daric, and established a system of weights and measures that facilitated trade from the borders of India to the shores of the Mediterranean. But the ambition of the King of Kings knew no bounds. Darius looked toward the European mainland, seeing the lands of Thrace and Macedonia as the next logical steps in the expansion of his world empire. In 513 before Christ, he led a colossal force across the Bosphorus, crossing a bridge of boats designed by Greek engineers. The Persians surged into the Balkans, subduing the tribes of Thrace and forcing the king of Macedon to offer earth and water, the traditional tokens of submission to the Persian crown. The empire now bordered the Greek heartland, and the independent city-states of the south began to realize that the Colossus of the East was no longer a distant myth. It was a reality at their very doorstep. For the Greeks of Ionia, living under Persian rule was a complex and often suffocating experience. While the Persians generally allowed them to practice their own religion and maintain their social customs, they also installed pro-Persian tyrants to rule the cities. These local rulers acted as the eyes and ears of the great king, ensuring that taxes were collected and that no seeds of rebellion were allowed to take root. For a people who were beginning to experiment with early forms of self-government and who prized their autonomy above all else, this was a bitter pill to swallow. The tension between the Greek desire for freedom and the Persian need for imperial order was reaching a breaking point. In the centers of learning and trade along the Ionian coast, philosophers and poets were already beginning to forge a sense of Hellenic identity, a feeling that they were fundamentally different from the subjects of the East. They saw themselves as citizens, not merely subjects, and the heavy hand of the Persian satraps was an affront to their dignity. Deep within the palace at Susa, Darius the Great likely gave little thought to the philosophical musings of a few Greek thinkers. He was the representative of Ahura Mazda on earth, the king who had brought order to a chaotic world. His inscriptions, carved into the living rock of mountainsides, proclaimed his greatness and the absolute nature of his power. To him, the Greeks were just another people to be incorporated into the grand design of the Achaemenid world. He did not yet know that these fractious, argumentative, and intensely proud people would provide the greatest challenge his empire would ever face. As the 6th century before Christ drew to a close, the stage was set for a confrontation that would define the course of Western history. On one side stood the Persian Empire, a miracle of organization and military might, commanding the resources of dozens of nations and a military host that seemed limitless. On the other stood a collection of small, often rivalrous Greek city-states, divided by geography and politics, yet united by a language and a culture that they were increasingly willing to fight for. The catalyst for the explosion was about to arrive. In the city of Miletus, a cunning and ambitious tyrant named Aristagoras was preparing a gambit that would set the entire Aegean on fire. He would spark a revolt that would drag the mainland Greeks into the fray, forcing the great king to turn his full, vengeful attention toward the west. The peace of the ancient world was about to be shattered, and the shadow of the Achaemenids was about to darken the very sun. The rise of the East had been a story of unprecedented success, a narrative of triumph that seemed to have no end. From the humble mountains of Persis, the Achaemenids had forged a world state that was as much an idea as it was a territory. It was a vision of universal peace under the guidance of a single, divinely appointed ruler. But as they looked toward the rugged hills of Greece, they were about to encounter a different kind of vision, one that placed the individual and the city-state at the center of the universe. The collision of these two worldviews would result in a series of wars that would be remembered as long as history is written. This was the world on the brink, a moment where the old empires of the East and the rising spirit of the West were about to meet in a storm of iron and fire. The great king was ready. The banners were raised. The march toward the sunset had begun. To the east of the Aegean, where the sun rises over the craggy peaks of Anatolia, the world was changing. In the late 6th century BC, the Ionian coast was a vibrant tapestry of Greek culture, a place where philosophy, art, and commerce flourished along the shoreline of Asia Minor. Here, cities like Miletus, Ephesus, and Samos served as the intellectual powerhouses of the Hellenic world, their white marble temples reflecting in the azure waters of the Mediterranean. But these were not independent states in the way we might understand them today. For since the time of Cyrus the Great, they had existed as jewels in the crown of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. They were part of a vast, multi-ethnic machine, governed by local tyrants who answered to the Persian satraps, the provincial governors ruling from the ancient Lydian capital of Sardis. For decades, a fragile peace had held. The Greeks paid their taxes and provided ships for the great king's campaigns, while in return they were left largely to their own devices. But by 499 BC, the winds of change were beginning to howl across the Meander Valley. At the heart of this coming storm stood one man, Aristagoras of Miletus. He was a man of immense ambition, serving as acting tyrant of Miletus while his father-in-law, Histiaeus, was detained at the Persian court in Susa. Histiaeus was a man who had once saved the great king Darius during his Scythian campaign, yet he found himself a gilded prisoner, longing for the salty air of his homeland. Whether it was a secret message tattooed onto the head of a slave or merely a shared sense of impending doom, the spark of rebellion was about to be struck. The catalyst was a failed expedition to the island of Naxos. Aristagoras had promised the Persian satrap, Artaphernes, a swift and easy conquest of the island, a move that would expand the empire's reach even further into the Aegean. But the siege was a disaster. Humiliated and fearing the inevitable wrath of the great king for his failure and the waste of imperial resources, Aristagoras realized his position was no longer tenable. In a desperate bid for survival, he did the unthinkable. He laid down his mantle as tyrant, declared Miletus a democracy, and incited the Ionian cities to rise up against their Persian masters. The Ionian revolt had begun. But Aristagoras was no fool. He knew that the might of Miletus alone could not hope to withstand the colossal weight of the Persian juggernaut. He needed allies. And so, in the winter of 499 BC, he crossed the sea to the Greek mainland, seeking the aid of the most famous warriors in the world. His first stop was Sparta. We are told by Herodotus that Aristagoras arrived at the court of King Cleomenes carrying a bronze map of the world, a marvel of geography that showed the vast distances of the Persian Empire. He spoke of the wealth of the East, of gold, silver, and precious fabrics, all waiting to be seized by the sharp spears of the Spartans. He painted a picture of an empire that was soft, its soldiers fighting in trousers and turbans, no match for the bronze-clad hoplites of the Peloponnese. But Cleomenes was a man of cold, hard reality. He asked the Ionian how far it was from the sea to the heart of the empire at Susa. When Aristagoras admitted it was a journey of 3 months, Cleomenes flatly refused. The Spartans were a people whose entire society was geared toward the stability of their own lands and the suppression of the Helots. To send their army on a 3-month march away from home was unthinkable. It was a strategic impossibility. Dejected, Aristagoras turned his gaze northward, toward a city that was currently experiencing its own radical transformation. Athens. The Athens that Aristagoras found was a city in the first flush of democracy. They had recently thrown off their own tyrants and were fiercely protective of their new-won freedom. Unlike the cautious Spartans, the Athenians felt a deep ancestral connection to the Ionians of Asia Minor. They saw them as their kin, their colonial offspring. Furthermore, they had their own grievances with the Persians. The exiled Athenian tyrant Hippias was currently at the court of Artaphernes in Sardis, whispering in the satrap's ear and plotting his return to power with Persian backing. For the Athenians, the struggle of the Ionians was not just a distant conflict. It was a battle for the survival of their own political experiment. They agreed to help. Along with the city of Eretria on the island of Euboea, the Athenians dispatched a fleet of 20 ships to the Anatolian shore. It was a small force, a mere fraction of the naval power they would later possess, but in the eyes of the great King Darius, it was a declaration of war that would change the course of history forever. In 498 BC, the allied force of Ionians, Athenians, and Eretrians gathered at Ephesus. From there, they marched inland, bypassing the main Persian garrisons and striking directly at the heart of the satrapy. Sardis. The city was a place of immense antiquity and wealth, the former capital of King Croesus. When the Greeks arrived, the satrap Artaphernes withdrew into the citadel with his garrison, leaving the lower city to the mercy of the invaders. In the chaos of the occupation, a fire broke out. It started, we are told, when a soldier set fire to a house thatched with reeds. The dry summer heat did the rest. The flames spread with terrifying speed, consuming the city and, most importantly, the sacred temple of Cybele, a goddess held in high esteem by the locals and the Persians alike. The burning of Sardis was a turning point. It was a symbolic blow against the prestige of the empire. When the news finally reached the great King Darius in far-off Susa, he did not react with immediate panic. Instead, he asked who these people were. Who were the Athenians? When he was told, he reportedly called for his bow and shot an arrow into the sky, calling upon the gods to grant him vengeance. He then commanded a servant to repeat the same 3 words to him every evening before he sat down to dinner. "Master, remember the Athenians." The Persian response was slow but relentless. The empire was like a glacier, moving with a ponderous but unstoppable force. While the Greeks celebrated their success and returned to the coast, the Persian military machine began to mobilize from every corner of the realm. Phoenician fleets were summoned from the Levant. Cypriot kings were brought back into line. Egyptian and Cilician soldiers were marched toward the Aegean. For the next several years, the Ionian revolt became a grueling war of attrition. The Greeks achieved some notable victories, particularly in Cyprus and the Hellespont, but they lacked a unified command and a clear long-term strategy. They were a collection of independent city-states, each with its own interests and rivalries, while the Persians were a monolithic entity with a single, unwavering will. By 494 BC, the rebellion had been pushed back to its starting point. Miletus. The city was now the final holdout, the last bastion of Ionian defiance. Off the coast of the city, near the small island of Lade, the two sides prepared for the decisive naval encounter that would decide the fate of the revolt. The Ionians had assembled a formidable fleet of over 300 triremes, the most advanced warships of the day. But the Persians brought 600, manned by the finest sailors of the ancient world, the Phoenicians. The Battle of Lade was a tragedy of disunity. During the weeks of preparation, the Ionian captains bickered and complained. They found the training regimes of the general Dionysius of Phocaea too grueling. On the day of the battle, as the two great fleets closed in, the fragility of the Greek alliance shattered. The contingents from Samos and Lesbos, having been bribed or intimidated by Persian agents, turned their ships and fled the scene before the fighting even began. The remaining Ionians, particularly those from Chios, fought with a desperate, suicidal bravery, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers. The sea turned red with the blood of the fallen, and the Ionian fleet was scattered to the winds. With the sea under their control, the Persians turned their attention to Miletus itself. The siege was short and brutal. The walls that had stood for centuries were undermined and breached. The city that had been the cradle of Greek philosophy was systematically dismantled. The men were put to the sword, and the women and children were led away into slavery, destined for the far reaches of the empire. The great temple of Apollo at Didyma was plundered and burned, its sacred treasures carried back to Susa. The fall of Miletus sent a shockwave through the entire Greek world. In Athens, the playwright Phrynichus produced a tragedy titled The Fall of Miletus. The audience was so overcome with grief and guilt that they burst into tears, and the city authorities fined the poet for reminding them of their own failure to save their kin. The Ionian revolt was over. The cities of Asia Minor were returned to the Persian yoke, their walls razed and their treasuries emptied. But for Darius, the account was not yet settled. The burning of Sardis still rankled, and the interference of the mainland Greeks could not go unpunished. The great king had realized that as long as Athens and Sparta remained free, his western frontier would never be truly secure. The spark that had been struck in Miletus had failed to burn down the empire, but it had succeeded in drawing the gaze of the King of Kings across the sea. The age of isolation was over. The Persian juggernaut was now turning its full, terrifying attention toward the rugged hills and independent spirits of Greece itself. The stage was being set for a clash of civilizations that would define the ancient world. The campaign to punish the Athenians was no longer a matter of if, but when. And as the Persian engineers began to bridge the Hellespont and the heralds set out to demand earth and water from the Greek cities, the people of the mainland began to realize that the storm was coming for them next. In the vast and shimmering halls of Susa, far removed from the salty spray of the Aegean, the great King Darius was a man possessed by a single, burning thought. To the master of an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the banks of the Nile, the insolence of the Greeks was not merely a border skirmish. It was a personal affront to the divine order of the world. Herodotus tells us of a particular ritual the king maintained during these years of simmering resentment. He appointed a slave to stand beside him every evening as he sat down to dine. 3 times, the servant would lean in and whisper the same chilling reminder into the royal ear. "Master, remember the Athenians." It is a striking image. One of the most powerful men to ever walk the earth, obsessed with a handful of city-states on the ragged edge of the known world. The year was 492 BC, and the first phase of what we now call the Persian Wars was about to begin in earnest. Darius had already crushed the Ionian revolt, turning the once proud city of Miletus into a charred ruin and selling its people into slavery. But the king knew that as long as the mainland Greeks remained free, they would continue to act as a beacon of hope for his restless subjects in Asia Minor. He needed to bring the hammer down. For this task, he turned to his young son-in-law, Mardonius. This was to be a massive combined operation of land and sea forces, designed to sweep across the northern coast of the Aegean, re-establishing Persian control over Thrace and Macedon before turning south to punish Athens and Eretria. As the Persian fleet hugged the coastline, the sheer scale of the expedition must have been a terrifying sight for the local tribes. Hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men moved like a slow, inexorable tide. At first, the campaign was a resounding success. Macedon, already a vassal state, was more firmly integrated into the imperial fold. The Thracian tribes were cowed into submission. But nature, it seems, had other plans. As the fleet attempted to round the treacherous peninsula of Mount Athos, a place still known today for its sudden and violent weather, a catastrophic storm broke upon them. Herodotus claims that 300 ships were lost and 20,000 men drowned or were taken by sea monsters in the churning depths. Mardonius, wounded and demoralized, was forced to limp back to Asia. The first great crossing had been thwarted, not by the spears of the Greeks, but by the winds of the north. Darius, however, was not a man to be discouraged by a single setback. He viewed the disaster at Athos as a mere delay. In 491 BC, he sent heralds across the sea to the Greek cities with a simple and terrifying demand. They were to provide earth and water. In the ancient Persian diplomatic language, this was a request for total submission. It was a recognition that the land and the very water that sustained life belonged to the King of Kings. Many of the island states and northern cities, fearing the inevitable, complied. But in Athens and Sparta, the response was one of defiant, almost suicidal bravado. In Athens, the Persian envoys were thrown into a pit used for criminals. In Sparta, they were tossed down a well and told that they could find all the earth and water they wanted at the bottom. The bridge of diplomacy was burned. Only war remained. By 490 BC, a second, more targeted expedition was ready. This time, Darius bypassed the dangerous northern route around Athos. Under the command of the Median general Datis and the king's nephew Artaphernes, a fleet of 600 triremes and horse transports sailed directly across the heart of the Aegean. This was a strategy of island hopping, designed to pick off the Greek allies one by one. Naxos was the first to fall. The Persians burned its temples in revenge for earlier resistance. Then came the turn of the island of Euboea. The city of Eretria, which had sent ships to aid the Ionian revolt, stood in the crosshairs. For 6 days, the Eretrians held their walls against a relentless assault. But on the 7th day, the city was betrayed from within. The gates were opened by 2 prominent citizens, and the Persian retribution was swift. Eretria was plundered, its sanctuaries torched, and its entire population chained to be dragged back to the depths of Asia. With Eretria in ashes, the Persian fleet turned toward Attica. They were guided by a ghost from the Athenian past. Hippias, the aged former tyrant of Athens who had been expelled decades earlier, was now a guest of the Persian court. He hoped to be restored to power as a puppet of the great king. It was Hippias who suggested the landing site. The plain of Marathon. Situated about 26 miles from the city of Athens, Marathon offered a wide, flat expanse perfect for the deployment of the formidable Persian cavalry. It was also a location where Hippias believed his old family connections might stir a pro-Persian uprising within the city. The news of the landing sent a wave of panic through the streets of Athens. The young democracy was facing its first true existential crisis. The Athenian assembly met in a state of high tension. Some argued for defending the city walls, while others, led by the charismatic and experienced Miltiades, insisted on meeting the enemy in the field. Miltiades knew the Persians well. He had once served under Darius as a local ruler in the Chersonese, and he understood both the strengths and the weaknesses of the imperial army. He convinced his fellow citizens that to stay behind the walls was to invite betrayal and starvation. The Athenians would march. A runner named Phidippides was dispatched to Sparta to plead for help. He covered the distance of 150 miles in just 2 days, a feat of incredible endurance. But the Spartan response was a frustrating blow. Though they promised to help, they were in the middle of a religious festival, the Carneia. Their laws forbade them from marching to war until the moon was full. The Athenians would have to face the Colossus alone, supported only by a brave contingent of 1,000 men from the small city of Plataea. When the Athenian army arrived at the hills overlooking the plain of Marathon, they saw a sight that must have chilled their blood. The Persian camp was a sprawling city of tents, and their ships lined the shore as far as the eye could see. For several days, the two armies watched each other in a tense standoff. The Greeks held the high ground, blocking the road to Athens. The Persians waited for the Greeks to descend or for the city to collapse into factional infighting. It was Miltiades who finally broke the deadlock. He received intelligence that the Persian cavalry, their most dangerous asset, was temporarily absent, perhaps being reloaded onto the ships for a surprise strike at Athens itself. Miltiades seized the moment. He convinced the Athenian polemarch, Callimachus, to cast the deciding vote for an immediate attack. To prevent the Persians from using their superior numbers to outflank the Greek line, Miltiades took a daring tactical risk. He thinned out his center to extend his wings, creating a line that matched the width of the Persian host. On a late summer morning, the Greeks did something entirely unheard of in ancient warfare. They began to run. Across the mile of open ground, the hoplites charged. The Persians, seeing this small force advancing without archers or cavalry to support them, thought the Greeks had gone mad. They prepared their own bows, unleashing a cloud of arrows that hissed through the air. But the Greeks, protected by their bronze helmets and heavy shields, kept coming. When the two lines collided, the sound of wood smashing against bronze echoed across the plain. The Persian center, made up of elite troops including the Immortals, held firm and even began to push the Greeks back. But on the flanks, the story was different. The Athenian and Plataean wings smashed through the lighter Persian infantry. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, the Greek wings turned inward, catching the Persian center in a deadly pincer movement. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Persians, panicked and disorganized, fled toward their ships, many of them being cut down in the marshes that fringed the plain. In the desperate struggle at the water's edge, Callimachus the polemarch was killed, and a brother of the playwright Aeschylus had his hand lopped off by an axe as he tried to hold onto a Persian ship. When the dust finally settled, 6,400 Persians lay dead on the field. The Athenians had lost only 192 men. But the danger was not yet over. As the remnants of the Persian fleet sailed around Cape Saunion toward the city, the Athenian army, exhausted and bloodstained, performed another miracle. They marched the 26 miles back to Athens at a grueling pace, arriving just in time to see the Persian ships appearing on the horizon. Datis and Artaphernes, seeing the same men they had just fought at Marathon now standing ready on the heights of the city, realized the game was up. They turned their prows back toward the east. The victory at Marathon was a watershed moment in world history. For the first time, a Greek army had defeated the Persians in a major pitched battle. The aura of imperial invincibility was shattered. For the Athenians, it was the ultimate vindication of their new democratic system. They had fought not as the subjects of a king, but as free citizens defending their own homes. The fallen were buried in a great mound on the battlefield, a monument that can still be visited today, standing as a silent testament to that extraordinary day. When the news of the defeat reached Darius, his fury was cold and absolute. He spent the next 3 years preparing for an even larger invasion, one that would involve the entire resources of his empire. But fate intervened. Before he could launch his great vengeance, the king died in 486 BC, leaving the task to his son, Xerxes. The first great crossing had ended in a stinging rebuke for the Persian Empire, but the storm was only just beginning to gather. The victory at Marathon had bought Greece a decade of peace, but it had also ensured that when the Persians returned, they would come with a force that would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. The struggle between the tiny Greek city-states and the global superpower was about to enter its most legendary and bloody chapter. For as the new king Xerxes took the throne, he looked not just to punish Athens, but to bring the entire European continent to its knees. In the coming years, the names of Thermopylae and Salamis would be written in fire and blood. Marathon. Today, the word is synonymous with a test of human endurance, a long-distance race that pushes the body to its absolute limits. But in the late summer of 490 before Christ, it was a place of existential dread. A crescent-shaped plain on the eastern coast of Attica, where the fate of a fledgling political experiment and perhaps the future of the entire Western world was to be decided. To look upon the Bay of Marathon today is to see a peaceful landscape of olive groves, vineyards, and a shimmering blue sea. But 25 centuries ago, the horizon was choked with the sails of 600 Persian triremes. This was no mere raiding party. This was the long arm of the great King Darius, reaching out from the heart of Asia to crush the defiant city-states that had dared to interfere in his imperial affairs. For Darius, the motivation was clear. Vengeance. A decade earlier, the Athenians had sent 20 ships to support the Ionian Greeks in their revolt against Persian rule. During that conflict, the regional capital of Sardis had been put to the torch, and the great king had not forgotten the insult. We are told that he tasked a servant to whisper in his ear every time he sat down to dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." This was a monarch who ruled over millions, a man who viewed himself as the instrument of the sky god Ahura Mazda. To him, The Greeks were not just enemies, they were rebels against the natural order of the world. The expedition was led by Datis, a seasoned Median admiral, and Artaphernes, the nephew of the king. Their mission was simple and brutal. Subjugate the islands of the Aegean, burn Eretria to the ground, and bring the leaders of Athens back to Susa in chains. Accompanying the Persian host was a ghost from the Athenian past. Hippias, the aged former tyrant of Athens who had been expelled 20 years earlier. He walked the sands of Marathon not as a liberator, but as a puppet, waiting to be restored to power by Persian spears. Herodotus records that Hippias had a dream the night before the landing. He dreamed he slept with his own mother, which he interpreted as a sign that he would return to his home and regain his motherland. But as he stepped onto the beach, he coughed so violently that one of his teeth fell out and was lost in the sand. He realized then, with a heavy heart, that the tooth was the only part of him that would ever truly possess the soil of Attica again. As the Persian tens of thousands disembarked, the news reached Athens. Panic and resolve vied for control of the city. The Athenians were newly democratic, having only recently discovered the power of the vote and the responsibility of self-governance. They knew that if they stayed behind their walls, they risked a long siege and the inevitable betrayal from within by those still loyal to the old tyrants. 10 generals were chosen, one from each of the 10 tribes of Athens, to lead the army. Among them was Miltiades, a man of unique experience. He had previously served as a tyrant in the Chersonese and had even served as a vassal under Darius during the Persian campaign against the Scythians. He knew how the Persians fought. He knew their strengths, and more importantly, he knew their weaknesses. It was Miltiades who argued that the Athenians must march out to meet the enemy at the shore. But they could not do it alone. A runner named Phidippides was dispatched to Sparta, the greatest military power in Greece, to plead for assistance. He ran 140 miles in less than 2 days, a feat of incredible athleticism. When he arrived in the Eurotas Valley, he found the Spartans in the midst of the Carneia, a sacred religious festival. With their characteristic religious strictness, the Spartans informed him that they could not march until the moon was full. They would come, they promised, but not for another 6 days. The Athenians stood alone. Or nearly so. As they reached the heights overlooking the plain of Marathon, a small force of 1,000 soldiers from the city of Plataea arrived. It was a gesture of immense bravery and loyalty that the Athenians would never forget. Together, the allied force numbered around 10 or 11,000 hoplites. Below them, stretched across the plain, was a Persian army that likely numbered at least 25,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry. For 5 days, the two armies watched one another. The Greeks held the high ground, blocking the paths to Athens. The Persians waited for the Greeks to descend, or for the signal from their allies inside the city that a coup was underway. The Greek hoplite was a formidable sight. Encased in bronze breastplates and greaves, carrying the heavy circular shield known as the aspis, they were a wall of metal. Their primary weapon was the dory, a spear nearly 8 feet long. They fought in the phalanx, a formation where each man protected the man to his left with his shield. It was a system that required absolute discipline and mutual trust. In contrast, the Persian infantry were lightly armored, wearing quilted tunics and carrying wicker shields. They relied on volume, raining down thousands of arrows to break the enemy before the hand-to-hand combat even began. On the morning of the battle, Miltiades saw his opening. Persian scouts reported that the formidable Persian cavalry, the elite of their force, were temporarily absent, perhaps being reloaded onto the ships for a flanking maneuver toward Athens. The command of the Greek army rotated daily between the 10 generals, and on this day it fell to a man who agreed with Miltiades. The Greeks formed up. Miltiades made a daring tactical decision. He knew the Persians usually placed their best troops in the center. To counter this, he thinned his own center to just a few ranks deep, while strengthening his wings. The distance between the two armies was about a mile. As the order was given, the Greeks did something the Persians had never seen before. They began to run. They did not walk in a slow, rhythmic pace, but charged across the plain at a full trot. The Persians, seeing this, thought the Greeks were insane. They believed a force so small, charging without the support of archers or cavalry, was surely committing suicide. But as the Greeks drew closer, the Persian arrows began to fly. By running, the hoplites minimized the time they were exposed to the deadly rain from above. The collision was thunderous. The bronze wall slammed into the Persian line with the force of a tidal wave. In the center, the Persians held their ground and eventually pushed the thin Greek line back toward the hills. But on the wings, the heavy Greek hoplites were unstoppable. They smashed through the Persian ranks, routing them. Then, instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy into the marshes, the Greek wings performed a disciplined pivot. They turned inward and crashed into the exposed flanks of the Persian center. The slaughter was immense. The Persians, caught in a pincer movement, broke and fled toward their ships. Many were driven into the great marsh to the north of the plain, where they were weighed down by their equipment and drowned in the mire. The Greeks pursued them to the very edge of the water, fighting in the surf to capture the triremes. It was here that Cynegeirus, the brother of the playwright Aeschylus, famously grabbed the stern of a Persian ship with his hand. A Persian soldier cut it off with an axe. He then grabbed it with his other hand, which was also severed. Finally, he grabbed it with his teeth before he was killed. It was this level of ferocity that defined the day. When the dust settled, the results were staggering. Herodotus tells us that 6,400 Persians had been killed. The Athenian dead numbered just 192. Among the fallen was the polemarch Callimachus, who had died fighting bravely in the thick of the action. But the danger was not over. The remaining Persian fleet began to sail around Cape Saunion, heading directly for the undefended city of Athens. The exhausted hoplites, having just fought a desperate battle in the summer heat, had no time to rest. They marched the 26 miles back to the city in record time, arriving just as the Persian ships appeared off the coast of Phalerum. Seeing the same men who had just defeated them at Marathon now standing ready on the heights of the city, Datis and Artaphernes realized the game was up. They turned their ships about and began the long journey back to Asia. The Spartans arrived the next day, having marched with incredible speed once the moon was full. They walked among the dead on the plain of Marathon, marveling at the fallen Persians, whose dress and armor were so alien to them. They praised the Athenians for their victory and returned to the Peloponnese. The significance of Marathon cannot be overstated. For the first time, a Greek army had defeated the Persians in a major pitched battle. The aura of Persian invincibility was shattered. For the Athenians, the victory became the foundational myth of their new democracy. They were no longer the subjects of a tyrant. They were the Marathonomachoi, the marathon men, who had stood as a shield against tyranny when the rest of the world trembled. They buried their dead on the battlefield itself, a rare honor, under a massive mound of earth that still stands today. Excavations in the 19th century confirmed the presence of charred bones and funeral vases from the era, a silent testament to the men who held the line. Yet, even in victory, there was a realization that this was only the beginning. Darius had failed, but the resources of the Persian Empire were vast. The great king would spend the rest of his life planning a much larger invasion, a task that would eventually fall to his son, Xerxes. The Greeks had won a battle, but the war for their very existence was far from over. Marathon had given them 10 years of peace, 10 years to prepare, and 10 years for the seeds of Greek unity to slowly, painfully, begin to grow. As the smoke cleared from the Athenian victory, the political landscape of Greece began to shift. The democracy was strengthened, its leaders emboldened. But beneath the celebrations, there was the knowledge that the dragon of the East was not dead, only wounded. The shield of Marathon had held, but the coming storm would require a sword that could strike at the heart of an empire. In the heart of the city, a new generation of leaders began to look toward the sea, realizing that if Athens was to survive the next encounter, she would need more than just hoplites. She would need a wooden wall of ships. The fields of Marathon were silent once more, but the echoes of the bronze on wicker would resonate for centuries, reminding the world that freedom, once tasted, is worth any price. In the heart of the Persian Empire, within the sprawling, sun-drenched palaces of Susa and Persepolis, the news of the defeat at Marathon must have landed with the weight of an impossible tragedy. For King Darius, the king of kings and ruler of the world, the loss of a mere expeditionary force on the fringes of the Western world was not a fatal blow to the empire, but it was a stinging insult to the prestige of the Achaemenid crown. We are told by the historian Herodotus that the great king's anger was so profound that he appointed a servant to stand by his side during every evening meal. 3 times a day, the servant would lean in and whisper a chilling reminder into the royal ear. "Master, remember the Athenians." The decade that followed the Battle of 490 BC is often viewed through the lens of Greek triumph, a time of celebration and democratic growth. But for the Persian Empire, it was a decade of methodical, colossal preparation. Darius was not a man to leave a grudge unsettled. He immediately began issuing orders to every satrapy of his vast realm, from the dust of the Indus Valley to the fertile banks of the Nile. He demanded ships, horses, grain, and men. The scale of the mobilization was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. This was not to be another exploratory foray. It was to be a total war, a final solution to the problem of the defiant Greek city-states. However, the path to vengeance was not a straight one. In 486 BC, the empire was rocked by a massive revolt in Egypt. The loss of the Egyptian breadbasket was a crisis that demanded the great king's immediate attention, forcing the invasion of Greece onto the back burner. Before Darius could lead his armies to reclaim the Nile, let alone cross the Aegean, the old king passed away. He died in his late 60s, leaving behind an empire that stretched across 3 continents and a legacy of administrative genius. He was buried in a magnificent rock-cut tomb at Nakshi-Rostam, his image carved forever into the cliffside, looking down upon his subjects with the serene confidence of a god. The crown passed to his son, Xerxes. History has often painted Xerxes as a petulant, volatile tyrant, a caricature shaped by the biases of Greek writers. In reality, he inherited a complex and volatile situation. Initially, Xerxes was hesitant to follow his father's obsession with the West. He was more concerned with stabilizing the empire, ruthlessly crushing the Egyptian revolt and later a rebellion in Babylon. It was his cousin, the ambitious general Mardonius, who reportedly whispered in his ear, urging him to take up the mantle of his father's unfinished business. Mardonius argued that it was not enough to simply rule. A great king had to be a conqueror, and the insolent Greeks provided the perfect stage for a display of imperial might. By 483 BC, the decision was made. The silence of the previous years was broken by the sound of 1,000 hammers and the rhythmic chanting of tens of thousands of labourers. Xerxes did not intend to rely on the unpredictable whims of the sea. He ordered the construction of a feat of engineering so audacious that it bordered on the hubristic. At the base of the Mount Athos Peninsula, where a Persian fleet had been wrecked by a storm a decade earlier, Xerxes ordered a canal to be cut through the isthmus. For 3 years, teams of men worked in shifts under the lash, carving a channel wide enough for 2 triremes to pass abreast. It was a statement of power, a message to the gods themselves that the great king would bend the very earth to his will. Further north, at the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, another wonder was taking shape. Xerxes ordered a bridge of boats to be constructed, spanning the mile-wide waters to allow his land army to march directly into the west. When a violent storm tore the first bridge apart, we are told that Xerxes was so enraged that he ordered the water itself to be punished. Executioners were sent to deliver 300 lashes to the Hellespont, and a pair of fetters was dropped into the depths to symbolize the sea's enslavement to the great king. It is easy to dismiss this as madness, but it served a psychological purpose. It demonstrated to his multi-ethnic army that their leader was a force of nature, a man before whom even the elements must bow. While the Persian juggernaut was gathering its strength, the Greek world was far from united. In Athens, the victory at Marathon had not brought peace, but rather a decade of intense political infighting. The city was divided between those who believed the Persian threat had passed and those who knew the storm was only gathering. At the center of this storm was a man named Themistocles. He was a new kind of politician, a populist with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. Unlike the traditional aristocrats, Themistocles looked at the horizon and saw only the glint of Persian bronze. In 483 BC, a stroke of incredible luck hit the Athenian treasury. A massive new vein of silver was discovered in the state-owned mines at Laurion. In a typical Greek democracy, this windfall would have been distributed among the citizens, providing a tidy sum for every man in the city. Themistocles, however, had a different plan. He stood before the assembly and delivered a speech that would change the course of history. He argued that the silver should not be spent on the present, but on the future. He convinced the Athenians to use the wealth to build a fleet of 200 triremes, the most advanced warships of the age. It was a massive gamble, a redirection of the city's entire economy toward a naval power they had never before wielded. To convince the skeptical public, he didn't even mention Persia. Instead, he claimed the ships were needed to fight a local war against the neighboring island of Aegina. It was a masterstroke of political manipulation that gave Athens the wooden walls it would soon desperately need. Themistocles also had to navigate the cryptic world of the divine. When the Athenians sent envoys to the oracle at Delphi to ask how they might survive the coming invasion, the response was terrifying. The priestess told them to flee to the ends of the earth, for nothing would be left of their city but ashes and ruin. Not satisfied with this doom, the envoys begged for a second prophecy. The oracle then spoke of a wooden wall which alone would remain uncaptured. While many in Athens thought this referred to the ancient thorn hedge around the Acropolis, Themistocles argued that the wooden wall meant the new fleet of ships. He was a man who understood that fate was often what one made of it. Meanwhile, in Sparta, the internal situation was equally fraught. The eccentric and brilliant king Cleomenes, who had done so much to shape Spartan policy in the previous decades, had met a gruesome and mysterious end. After being driven into exile and later returning, he was said to have gone completely insane, eventually killing himself in a manner so violent that many suspected foul play. The throne of the Agiad house passed to his half-brother, Leonidas. At the time, Leonidas was already a man in his 50s, a veteran of the Agoge and a product of the rigid Spartan system. He was a king who ruled over a state that was increasingly paranoid. The Spartans were aware of the Persian build-up, but their first priority was always the security of the Peloponnese and the suppression of their slave population, the Helots. By 481 BC, the shadow of the great king had finally reached the shores of the Greek mainland. Xerxes sent heralds to every city-state, with the notable exceptions of Athens and Sparta, demanding the traditional tokens of submission, earth, and water. Many cities, paralyzed by fear or seeking to profit from the changing tide, complied. They were the Medisers, those who chose the security of the yoke over the uncertainty of the spear. But in the south, a defiant core remained. The representatives of the Greek states met at the Isthmus of Corinth to form a defensive alliance. It was a fragile and fractious gathering. Ancient rivalries and deep-seated suspicions threatened to tear the coalition apart before a single Persian soldier had even set foot in Europe. The Spartans, with their peerless military reputation, were given command of the land forces, while the Athenians, despite providing the bulk of the fleet, eventually conceded naval command to a Spartan admiral to maintain unity. It was a moment of unprecedented cooperation in a culture defined by competition. As the winter of 481 BC turned to the spring of 480, the time for diplomacy and preparation had ended. In the city of Sardis, the great king Xerxes watched as his army began to move. It was a host of nations, a sea of color and steel that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were Persians in their soft felt caps and tunics of chainmail, Medes with their round shields, Assyrians with their bronze helmets and iron-studded clubs, and even Ethiopians clad in leopard skins. They were supported by a fleet of over 1,000 ships, manned by Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Ionian Greeks. The sheer logistical scale of the march was staggering. Supply depots had been established along the route years in advance. The army moved like a slow, irresistible tide, drinking rivers dry and consuming the resources of entire provinces in a single day. As Xerxes sat upon his golden throne, watching his soldiers cross the Hellespont bridge, he is said to have wept. When asked why, he replied that he was struck by the brevity of human life, that in 100 years, not one man in that vast assembly would still be alive. It was a rare moment of introspection for a man who considered himself the master of the world. The decade of silence was over. The Greeks had used those 10 years to build ships and forge a desperate alliance, while the Persians had used them to mobilize the resources of an entire continent. The stage was now set for a clash between two fundamentally different ways of life, a conflict that would determine the trajectory of Western civilization. The great king was coming, and he brought with him the weight of the world. In the narrow passes and choppy waters of the south, the Greeks prepared to meet him, knowing that the echoes of their resistance would either be silenced forever or ring out across the millennia. The fields of Marathon were a memory, but the road to Thermopylae was now open. In the autumn of 486 BC, the great king Darius passed away, leaving the most vast empire the world had ever seen to his son, Xerxes. Darius had died with the taste of defeat at Marathon still bitter in his mouth, a failure that had haunted the final years of his reign. For the Persians, the defeat had not been a catastrophic blow to their imperial power, but it was a stinging insult from a handful of fringe states on the edge of the civilized world. To Xerxes, the conquest of Greece was more than just a matter of imperial expansion. It was an inheritance of vengeance. He was no longer merely a king. He was the king of kings, the successor to Cyrus and Darius, and the representative of the sky god Ahura Mazda on earth. But before the Greeks could be punished, the empire had to be secured. Revolts in Egypt and Babylon were crushed with a ruthless efficiency that served as a grim precursor to what awaited the Hellenes. By 481 BC, the eyes of the Colossus were turned once more toward the setting sun. Unlike the expedition of 10 years earlier, which had been primarily a naval foray, Xerxes envisioned a conquest of a different magnitude. This was to be a total invasion, a tidal wave of humanity that would sweep across the Hellespont and march into Europe, supported by a fleet so large it would turn the Aegean into a Persian lake. For 4 years, the resources of an entire continent were mobilized. From the distant plains of Bactria to the sweltering banks of the Nile, the order went out to assemble. This was the first time in history that a state had attempted logistics on such a staggering scale. Provisions were stored in great depots along the Thracian coast. Roads were leveled. But most impressive of all were the engineering marvels that sought to bend nature itself to the will of the great king. The first of these was the canal at Mount Athos. A decade earlier, a Persian fleet had been shattered against the rocky cliffs of the Chalcidice Peninsula by a violent storm. Xerxes, determined that his ships would not face such a fate again, ordered a canal to be cut through the isthmus of the peninsula. For 3 years, gangs of men under the lash of Persian overseers labored to dig a passage wide enough for 2 triremes to pass abreast. It was a display of sheer hubris that shocked the Greek world. To the Greeks, who lived in harmony with their rugged landscape, such an act was a violation of the natural order. But to Xerxes, it was a simple statement of fact. If a mountain stood in the way of the King of Kings, the mountain would be moved. Even more audacious was the bridging of the Hellespont. The narrow strait separating Asia from Europe was a place of treacherous currents and sudden gales. Xerxes commanded his Phoenician and Egyptian engineers to build a bridge of boats to carry his land army across. When the first attempt was destroyed by a violent storm, the fury of the king was legendary. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes ordered the sea itself to be punished. Executioners were sent to deliver 300 lashes to the water, while a pair of fetters was dropped into the depths to symbolically enslave the strait. The engineers of the first bridge were beheaded, replaced by men who understood that failure was not an option. The second attempt was a triumph of ancient engineering. 2 parallel lines of ships, numbering over 600 in total, were moored together with massive cables of flax and papyrus. Planks were laid across them, covered with brush and earth to create a solid roadway so stable that the horses and pack animals would not be spooked by the sight of the rushing water beneath. It was a bridge between worlds, a physical link that brought the might of the East into the heart of the West. In the spring of 480 BC, as the sun rose over the hills of Asia, the crossing began. It is said the march lasted 7 days and 7 nights without pause. Leading the way were the 10,000 immortals, their silver and gold pomegranates glinting in the morning light. Behind them came the multitudinous host of the empire, a dizzying array of cultures, languages, and armaments. Herodotus, perhaps with a touch of poetic exaggeration, claimed the Persian army numbered over 5 million people. Modern historians suggest a more conservative figure, perhaps 200,000 soldiers and 1,000 ships, but even this lower estimate would have been the largest force ever assembled in the history of warfare to that point. It was a moving city, a colossus that consumed the resources of every land it passed through. Rivers were said to have run dry as the army stopped to drink, and entire cities were bankrupted by the cost of feeding the king and his entourage for a single day. At Dariscus, in Thrace, Xerxes held a great review of his troops. Standing in his golden chariot, he watched as the various contingents marched past. There were Persians and Medes in their soft felt caps and tunics of iron scales. There were Assyrians with their brass helmets and iron-studded clubs. There were Indians in cotton dress, carrying boughs of cane. There were even Greeks from the already conquered cities of Ionia, forced to march against their kin. As he looked out over the vast sea of humanity, we are told that Xerxes wept. When asked why, he replied that he was struck by the brevity of human life. In 100 years, he said, not one of these men would be alive. It was a rare moment of reflection for a man who otherwise saw himself as the master of fate. Yet, the march continued. Through Thrace and into Macedon, the Persian juggernaut rolled forwards. King Alexander I of Macedon, seeing the futility of resistance, offered his submission, becoming a reluctant vassal of the great king. The northern states of Greece were falling like dominoes, and the shadow of the empire was now stretching toward the heartlands of the south. In the Greek city-states, the news of the Persian approach was met with a mixture of defiance and cold terror. The Greeks were a notoriously fractured people, more often at war with one another than not. The concept of a pan-Hellenic identity was a fragile thing, often second to the loyalty one felt for their own polis. But the scale of the Persian threat was forcing a change. In 481 BC, a congress of Greek states met at the Isthmus of Corinth to discuss a common defense. It was a historic moment. Old enemies like Athens and Aegina set aside their blood feuds. A general appeal for aid was sent to the wider Greek world, including the powerful colonies in Sicily, though little help would come from the west. At the center of the resistance stood two very different powers. There was Sparta, the militarized society of the Peloponnese, whose land army was the most feared in the world. And there was Athens, the young democracy that was rapidly becoming a naval powerhouse. The rise of the Athenian navy was thanks largely to the vision of one man, Themistocles. A few years earlier, a massive vein of silver had been discovered in the state mines at Laurium. While many Athenians wanted to distribute the wealth among the citizenry, Themistocles persuaded them to use the money to build a fleet of 200 triremes. He argued that the Persians would return, and when they did, the wooden walls of the ships would be the only thing standing between Athens and destruction. Themistocles was a man of immense cunning and foresight, a sharp contrast to the austere and tradition-bound Spartans. Yet, for the alliance to work, the two had to find common ground. The Spartans, as the traditional leaders of the Greek world, were given supreme command of both the land and sea forces, even though the Athenians provided the bulk of the ships. It was a delicate political balancing act, held together by the grim realization that if they did not stand together, they would surely hang separately. As the Persians reached the borders of Thessaly, the Greeks were still debating where to make their stand. The first plan, to hold the pass of Tempe in the north, was abandoned when it was realized the Persians could simply bypass it. This forced a retreat to the south, leaving the fertile plains of Thessaly to the mercy of the invaders. The situation was looking increasingly desperate. The oracle at Delphi, the most sacred site in the Greek world, was issuing prophecies of doom. The priests there, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, advised the Greeks to flee to the ends of the earth. To many, it seemed the gods themselves had abandoned Greece. Yet, amid the panic, a strategy began to emerge. The Greeks knew they could not defeat the Persians in an open plain where the superior numbers and cavalry of the great king would overwhelm them. They needed a choke point. They needed a place where the geography would act as a force multiplier, nullifying the Persian advantage. For the land army, that place was the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. For the navy, it was the straits off Cape Artemisium. The plan was a gamble of the highest stakes. A small force would be sent to the pass to hold back the Persian millions for as long as possible, while the fleet engaged the Persian ships nearby. Among the Greeks, the Spartans were the obvious choice to lead the land defense. But there was a problem. The Spartans were in the midst of celebrating the festival of the Carnia, a sacred time during which military activity was strictly forbidden by religious law. To march in full force would be to risk the wrath of the gods. But the king, Leonidas, realized that to wait would be to lose everything. In a compromise between piety and necessity, he decided to march with only his personal bodyguard of 300 men, along with a few thousand allies from other states. These 300 were not just any soldiers. They were the elite, and crucially, they were all men who already had living sons to carry on their names. They knew they were marching to their deaths. As Leonidas and his small force headed north, they passed through the heart of a Greece that was already beginning to buckle. The air was thick with the scent of sacrifice and the sound of lamentation. The Persians were no longer a distant threat. They were a reality. The great king had crossed the Hellespont. He had whipped the sea and channeled the mountains. He had brought the world with him to crush the pride of a few stubborn cities. The road to the south lay open, and the only thing standing in the way of the total eclipse of Greek freedom was a narrow track between the cliffs and the sea. The stage was set for the most famous clash in history. The King of Kings was coming, and the Hot Gates were waiting. Xerxes believed he was marching to a victory that would cement his legacy for all eternity, but in the rugged landscape of the Malian Gulf, he was about to discover that there were some things that even the master of the world could not command. The march of the Colossus was nearing its destination, and the silence of the pass was about to be broken by the clash of bronze on iron. Thermopylae. It is a name that has become synonymous with the very idea of the heroic last stand. To the Greeks of 480 BC, it was known simply as the Hot Gates, named for the sulphurous springs that bubbled from the earth, a place where the mountains of Kallidromos pressed so tightly against the Malian Gulf that only a single cart could pass at a time. It was here, in this narrow corridor of salt marsh and limestone, that the fate of the Hellenic world would be decided. As the dust clouds from the approaching Persian host began to stain the northern horizon, the allied Greek force, a mere few thousand strong, began their work. They were led by a man who had already passed his 50th year, a king of the Aegead line who carried the weight of a dire prophecy upon his shoulders. Leonidas of Sparta. While the great king Xerxes waited 4 days for the Greeks to flee in terror, he sent a lone horseman to scout their position. What the rider saw was something that defied Persian logic. In front of a rebuilt Phocian wall, a group of men were engaged in what looked like a festival. Some were stripped bare, their skin glistening with oil as they wrestled and performed gymnastics in the humid summer air. Others sat calmly on the grass, carefully combing their long, flowing hair. When the scout returned and reported these findings, Xerxes is said to have laughed. To him, these were the actions of vain and foolish men, perhaps even madmen, preparing for a parade rather than a massacre. But among the Persian entourage was Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king who had fled his homeland years before. He did not laugh. He explained to the great king that the Spartans always adorned their hair when they were about to risk their lives. They were not preening for a show, they were preparing for a beautiful death. The Spartans who stood at the gates were a unique breed, even by the standards of the ancient world. They were the 300, a symbolic number chosen with grim precision. Leonidas had not called for a general levy of the Spartan army. Instead, he had hand-picked each man based on a single, haunting criterion. Every soldier present had to have a living son at home. This was a suicide mission, and the king knew it. By ensuring his men had heirs, he was ensuring that their bloodlines would not vanish when they fell in the pass. They were the elite of the elite, the products of the agoge, a state-sponsored system of education and brutality that broke the individual to forge the phalanx. From the age of 7, these men had been raised in the company of wolves, taught to endure hunger, cold, and the lash of the whip without a whimper. To them, the battlefield was the only place where they truly felt at home, for the rigors of war were actually lighter than the rigors of their training. The Spartan mindset was one of absolute, laconic defiance. This was a society where speech was as guarded as a fortress. When Xerxes finally sent a herald demanding that the Greeks lay down their arms in exchange for their lives and the title of friends of the Persian people, the response from Leonidas was just 2 words. Molen lab. Come and take them. It was a statement of belligerent arrogance that has echoed through the centuries, a refusal to negotiate with the inevitable. But while the Spartans provided the iron core of the defense, they were not alone. Beside them stood 700 Thespians, 400 the bands, and several thousand other Peloponnesians and Phocians. They were a fragile coalition of city-states, many of whom were traditional enemies, now huddled together in the shadow of a common extinction. On the 5th day, the patience of the King of Kings finally broke. He ordered his Medes and Kishans to move forward and take the Greeks alive, to bring these insolent rebels to his feet in chains. The Persians approached in a vast, multicolored wave, a sea of wicker shields and soft felt caps. They were used to the open plains of Asia, where their superior numbers and swarms of horse archers could envelop and crush any foe. But here, in the bottleneck of the pass, their numbers counted for nothing. The Greeks stood in a dense forest of bronze, their large round shields, the aspis, overlapping to form an unbroken wall of metal. Their spears, the dory, were significantly longer than the Persian javelins, allowing them to stab and kill before the enemy could even close the distance. The slaughter was immediate and horrific. The Medes threw themselves against the Greek line only to be impaled on a hedge of spears. Because the pass was so narrow, only a fraction of the Persian army could engage at any one time. The Greeks, meanwhile, utilized a system of rotation, pulling tired men back and pushing fresh ones to the front, maintaining a constant, lethal pressure. Even the famed Persian archers, whose volleys were said to hide the sun, found their arrows spent uselessly against the heavy bronze armor and thick wood of the Greek shields. It was then that a Spartan named Dionysus supposedly made his most famous remark. "If the Persians hide the sun," he said, "then we shall have our battle in the shade." Frustrated by the failure of his vanguard, Xerxes sent in his personal guard, the Immortals. These were the 10,000 most feared warriors in the empire, so named because their numbers were always kept at a full 10,000. If one fell, another immediately took his place. They were the men who had conquered Babylon and Egypt, elite heavy infantry who moved with a terrifying, silent discipline. But even they could not break the Spartan phalanx. The Spartans employed a brilliant tactical feint, pretending to break and run in a panicked retreat. When the Immortals broke cover and rushed forward in a disorganized mass to finish the job, the Spartans suddenly spun around, reformed their line in an instant, and butchered the overextended Persians. 3 times, Xerxes is said to have leapt up from his throne in agitation as he watched his finest troops being systematically dismantled by a force that should have been crushed in an hour. The second day of fighting was a repetition of the first. The Greeks held, their wall of bronze remaining unbreached despite the piles of Persian dead that began to clog the pass. But the tide was about to turn, not through strength of arms, but through the oldest of human failings: treachery. A local Greek man named Ephialtes, hoping for a rich reward from the great king, sought an audience with Xerxes. He told the king of a hidden mountain path, the Anapaia path, which wound its way through the heights of Mount Kallidromos and emerged behind the Greek position. Under the cover of a moonless night, the Persian general Hydarnes led the remaining immortals up the steep, oak-forested slopes. The Phocian guards who had been stationed to watch the path were caught by surprise in the dawn mist. Thinking they were the main target of the attack, they retreated to a higher peak to make a stand, but the Persians simply ignored them and began their descent toward the rear of the Hot Gates. When the news reached the Greek camp that they were being surrounded, Leonidas faced a final, decisive choice. He knew that to stay was to die. Most of the allied contingents were dismissed, sent back south to defend their own cities and to live to fight another day. But Leonidas and his 300 would stay. They were joined by the 700 Thespians who refused to abandon their allies, and the bands who were held perhaps as much as hostages as soldiers. The Spartans stayed because their laws forbade retreat. To return to Sparta without his shield was a fate worse than death for a warrior of the Agoge. They would stay to fulfill the prophecy of Delphi, that either Sparta must fall or a king must perish. On the final morning, the atmosphere in the Greek camp was not one of despair, but of a strange, dark revelry. Leonidas famously told his men to eat a hearty breakfast, for that night they would dine in the underworld. They did not wait for the Persians to attack them in the bottleneck. Instead, they marched out into the wider part of the valley to meet the enemy head-on, seeking to kill as many as possible before the end. The fighting was more savage than anything that had come before. Spears shattered, and the Greeks drew their short swords, the xiphos, hacking their way into the heart of the Persian masses. In the chaos, 2 of Xerxes' own brothers were slain. Then, Leonidas himself fell. What followed was a struggle for the king's body that felt like a scene from the Iliad. For times the Greeks pushed the Persians back to protect the fallen Leonidas, their numbers dwindling with every passing minute. When the immortals finally appeared in their rear, the surviving Greeks retreated to a small hillock, later known as Kolonos Hill. There, surrounded on all sides, they fought with their remaining blades, then with their hands and teeth, until the Persians, afraid to close any further, simply overwhelmed them with a final, massive rain of arrows and javelins. When the silence finally returned to the pass of Thermopylae, the Persian king walked among the carpet of corpses. He was so incensed by the resistance he had faced that he ordered the head of Leonidas to be cut off and fixed upon a pole, a rare act of desecration from a monarch usually known for his magnanimity. But the damage had already been done. Though the Persians had won the pass, the myth of their invincibility had been shattered. The 3 days of delay had allowed the Athenian fleet to engage the Persians at Artemisium and then retreat to Salamis. More importantly, the story of the 300 began to spread like wildfire through the Greek cities. It was no longer a war of distant kings and satraps. It was a struggle for the very soul of Hellas. Today, if you visit the site of the battle, you will not see the sea lapping against the cliffs. Over the millennia, the shoreline has receded miles away, leaving a wide, dry plain where the waves once crashed. But the hill of Kolonos remains. In 1939, archaeologists excavating the mound found hundreds of Persian bronze arrowheads buried in the soil, the physical remains of that final, lethal volley. And near the site of the Phocian wall stands a modern monument, but it is the ancient words of the poet Simonides that truly capture the spirit of the place. Written on a simple stone long ago, they addressed any traveler who passed through the Hot Gates. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Leonidas and his men had not saved Greece at Thermopylae, but they had given it something far more valuable than a strategic victory. They had given it a reason to fight. The march of the Persian Colossus continued toward the heart of Attica, but the ghost of the 300 now marched beside every Greek who dared to lift a shield. The road south from Thermopylae was no longer a path of resistance, but a corridor for the inexorable. As the summer heat of 480 before Christ began to wane, a heavy and suffocating silence fell over the landscapes of Phocis and Boeotia. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 had been a moral triumph, a feat of arms that would indeed ring out across the millennia, but in the immediate, cold reality of the 5th century before Christ, it was a strategic catastrophe. The gateway to central Greece had been kicked wide open. For the great King Xerxes, the path to his ultimate prize was now clear. He did not merely seek the submission of the Greeks. He sought the total annihilation of the city that had dared to defy his father a decade earlier. He sought the embers of Athens. To look at the map of Greece in those frantic weeks following the fall of the pass is to see a world in total collapse. The allied Greek fleet, having fought the Persians to a bloody stalemate at the cliffs of Artemisium, received the news of the disaster at the Hot Gates with a sense of grim finality. There was no longer any point in guarding the coast if the land behind them was crawling with the enemy. Under the cover of darkness, the triremes slipped away, retreating south toward the Saronic Gulf. Behind them, the Persian juggernaut began its descent. We are told by Herodotus that as the great king marched, he left a trail of desolation in his wake. Cities like Panopeus and Daulis were put to the torch. The sacred groves were hacked down. It was a message intended for all who still considered resistance. Submit or be erased. In Athens, the atmosphere was one of calculated desperation. While the Spartans and their Peloponnesian allies were already busy digging trenches and raising a great wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, essentially writing off everything north of the Peloponnese, the Athenians stood alone. Their leader, Themistocles, was perhaps the most cunning and far-sighted man of his age. He knew that the city of stone and timber could not be saved, but he believed the idea of Athens could survive on the water. Earlier that year, the Athenians had sent envoys to the oracle at Delphi, seeking divine guidance in the face of the storm. The response they received was terrifying. The priestess told them to flee to the ends of the earth, for everything would be brought low by the fire and the sharp sword of ours. But Themistocles was not a man to accept a prophecy of doom so easily. A second consultation produced the famous and cryptic advice that a wooden wall alone would remain unconquered and would save the Athenians and their children. While some argued this meant the old thorn hedge around the Acropolis, Themistocles insisted it referred to the newly built fleet of triremes. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. He was asking an entire population to walk away from their ancestral homes, their temples, and the graves of their fathers, and to trust their lives to the wooden hulls of ships. The scenes that followed must have been among the most heart-wrenching in the history of the ancient world. The Decree of Trozen, an ancient inscription found centuries later, purports to record the official order for the evacuation. Every Athenian was to leave the city. The women and children were to be sent to the safety of Trozen in the Peloponnese or to the island of Aegina. The elderly were to be moved to Salamis. The men of military age were to board the ships. We can only imagine the chaos and the grief at the port of Piraeus as families were torn apart, clutching whatever meager possessions they could carry, watching the horizon for the first signs of Persian smoke. By the time the vanguard of the Persian army reached the borders of Attica, Athens was a ghost city. The streets that once buzzed with the debates of a young democracy were silent. The markets were empty. The dogs wandered the alleys, howling for masters who were now miles away across the water. Yet, the city was not entirely abandoned. High atop the Acropolis, the sacred citadel that rises like a crown above the Athenian plain, a small group of holdouts remained. They were mostly the poor, the elderly, and the temple guardians who either could not bring themselves to leave or who truly believed that the wooden wall of the oracle meant the barricades they had built at the gates of the sanctuary. When Xerxes arrived at the gates of Athens, he found a prize that was both magnificent and hollow. From the heights of the Areopagus, the hill of Ars, the Persian archers looked across at the Acropolis. They saw a handful of defiant men standing behind makeshift wooden fences. The great king, perhaps amused or perhaps merely eager to finish the task, ordered his men to unleash fire. Arrows tipped with burning tow were launched into the wooden barricades, and soon the defences of the Acropolis were a roaring inferno. Even then, the defenders did not surrender. When the Persians attempted to storm the main gates, the Greeks rolled down massive stones, crushing the attackers and holding the heights for days. It was a miniature Thermopylae played out on the steppes of the gods. But the end was inevitable. According to the ancient accounts, a few Persian soldiers discovered a secret, steep path on the north side of the Acropolis, near the sanctuary of Aglaurus. They scaled the sheer rock face and emerged behind the defenders. The massacre was swift and brutal. Some of the Greeks threw themselves off the cliffs in despair. Others sought sanctuary inside the temple of the goddess Athena, but the Persians showed no mercy. The doors were burst open, the priests were slaughtered on the holy ground, and the treasures of centuries were plundered. Then came the fire. Xerxes ordered the temples to be put to the torch. From the shores of Salamis, the Athenian refugees looked back toward their home and saw a sight that would be burned into their collective memory for generations. A column of black smoke rose into the clear blue sky, and as night fell, the Acropolis glowed with a hellish orange light. The ancient wooden statue of Athena, the most sacred object in the city, was consumed by flames. The temples of the gods were reduced to blackened husks. It was the lowest point in the history of the Greek world. To any outside observer, it seemed that the war was over. The great city of Athens had fallen. Its people were in exile. Its gods were homeless. Yet, in this moment of total darkness, the resolve of the Greeks did not shatter. It hardened. The sight of their burning city did not make the Athenians sue for peace. Instead, it bound them to their ships with a ferocious, singular purpose. They had nothing left to lose but their lives and their freedom. But if the Athenians were ready to fight, their allies were not. The Peloponnesians, led by the Spartans, remained obsessed with the defense of the isthmus. To them, Athens was already gone, and the fleet should retreat to the Peloponnese to support the land army at the wall. The debates held in the Greek camp at Salamis in the days following the fall of Athens were as fierce as any battle. The Spartan commander, Eurybides, held the nominal leadership of the fleet, but it was Themistocles who provided the fire. He knew that if the fleet retreated to the isthmus, it would break apart. The contingents from Aegina, Megara, and Athens would refuse to abandon their families on the islands. He argued that the narrow straits of Salamis offered the only chance to negate the superior numbers of the Persian navy. In one famous exchange, a Corinthian commander reminded Themistocles that he was now a man without a city and therefore had no right to speak. Themistocles replied that as long as the Athenians had 200 ships manned and ready, they had a city more powerful than any in Greece. While the Greeks argued, Xerxes was savoring his victory. He sent a messenger back to Susa to announce that the insolent city had been destroyed. He sat on his golden throne on the slopes of Mount Aigaleos, looking down at the narrow waters where the Greek fleet lay huddled. To him, they looked like cornered animals, trapped between his army on the shore and his massive fleet blocking the exits. He believed the war would be over by sunset the following day. He did not understand that he had not destroyed Athens. He had merely forced it into its final, most dangerous form. The fall of Athens was a pivot point in the human story. It was the moment when the physical structures of a civilization were stripped away, leaving only the spirit of the people who inhabited them. The landscape of Attica was now a Persian province, and the smoke from the Acropolis drifted across the Aegean as a warning to all. But in the shadows of the islands, the wooden walls were waiting. The Spartans, usually so cautious, were about to see what happens when a people are pushed to the very edge of existence. The stage was set for the most important naval engagement in history. The Persian king of kings believed he had won, but as the sun began to rise over the Saronic Gulf, he would soon realize that the Greeks were never more dangerous than when they had nothing left to go home to. The fall of the city was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a legend. The ruins of the Acropolis would eventually be rebuilt in even greater splendor, but the memory of the fire would remain. It was a reminder that freedom is not found in stone or gold, but in the will of those who refuse to bow. As the Greek sailors took up their oars and the Athenian refugees watched from the rocky shores of Salamis, the era of the city-state was about to be forged in the heat of a battle that would decide the fate of the Western world. This was the dark before the dawn, and the smoke over the Acropolis was the signal that the real war was only just beginning. You have been watching History Time. We will return to the waters of Salamis in the next segment. Athens was a city of ghosts. By the late summer of 480 BC, the winding streets that had once hummed with the vibrant energy of a new democracy were silent, save for the crackle of flame and the heavy tread of Persian boots. The Acropolis, that sacred limestone heart of the city, was shrouded in a thick, black veil of smoke. The great king Xerxes had arrived. His vengeance for the burning of Sardis and the humiliation at Marathon was finally being realized. The temples were plundered, the statues of the gods toppled, and the very ground of Attica was claimed for the Persian Empire. For any other nation, the fall of its capital would have signaled the end. But for the Athenians, and for the coalition of Greeks huddled on the nearby island of Salamis, the city was no longer made of stone and mortar. It was a fleet of ships. The decision to abandon the city had not been an easy one. It was born from one of the most famous and cryptic moments in the history of the ancient world. Months earlier, as the Persian juggernaut began its slow, inevitable crawl toward the Greek heartlands, the Athenians had sent envoys to the oracle at Delphi. They sought guidance from the Pythia, the priestess who spoke for Apollo himself. Her first response was a terrifying vision of absolute doom. She told them to flee to the ends of the earth, for nothing would be left standing, neither head nor body, nor feet nor hands. It was a prophecy of total annihilation. However, the Athenians begged for a second word, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. It was then that the oracle spoke the words that would change the course of history. She told them that while all else would be taken, Zeus the all-seeing would grant that the wooden wall only should not fall, but help the Athenians and their children. To many in Athens, this was a literal instruction to fortify the wooden palisade around the Acropolis. But there was one man who saw a different truth. Themistocles, the populist leader and naval visionary, argued that the wooden walls were not fences or fortifications. They were the triremes. He insisted that the salvation of Greece lay not on the land, but on the water. Now, as they watched their city burn from across the narrow straits, that prophecy was being put to the ultimate test. The situation was desperate. The Greek fleet was a fragile coalition of city-states, many of whom were on the verge of splintering. While the Athenians provided the largest contingent of ships, the overall command was held by a Spartan, the Admiral Eurybides. This was a necessary political concession. The other Peloponnesian states, like Corinth and Aegina, would never have agreed to serve under an Athenian commander. Yet, the tension between these leaders was at a breaking point. The Spartans and the Corinthians wanted to retreat. Their eyes were fixed firmly on the Peloponnese. They argued that the fleet should move to the Isthmus of Corinth, where a massive wall was being constructed to block the land approach to their southern sanctuary. They believed that if they were defeated at Salamis, they would be trapped and besieged on a small island. At the Isthmus, they felt they had a chance to defend their own homes. Themistocles, however, knew that if the fleet retreated to the Isthmus, it would simply dissolve. The various contingents would sail away to protect their own individual cities, and the Greek cause would be lost. The debates in the Greek camp were as fierce as any battle. We are told of a moment when the Corinthian commander, Adimantus, insulted Themistocles, reminding him that he was a man without a city, a refugee from a burned-out shell. Themistocles retorted that as long as he had 200 ships fully manned, he had a city greater than any in Greece. He even threatened that if the Allies abandoned Salamis, the Athenians would pack up their families and sail away to Italy to found a new colony, leaving the Peloponnesians to face the Persian navy alone. It was a high-stakes game of political brinkmanship. But even with his threats, Themistocles knew he could not hold the coalition together by words alone. He needed to force a battle. He needed to trap the Greeks into fighting, and he needed to trap the Persians into a location where their superior numbers would become a liability. In the dead of night, he sent a trusted slave named Sisinus across the water to the Persian camp. Sisinus carried a message for Xerxes himself. The message claimed that Themistocles had changed sides and that the Greeks were in a state of blind panic, planning to flee under the cover of darkness. If Xerxes attacked now, he would catch them in total disarray and end the war in a single stroke. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Xerxes, sitting in his opulent camp, was eager for a final victory. He had been delayed at Thermopylae, and he knew that the sailing season was drawing to a close. He could not afford a long, drawn-out blockade. He believed the message. He ordered his fleet to move immediately, blocking the exits of the straits, and sentries were posted to watch for any escaping Greek vessels. Throughout the night, the Persian sailors labored at their oars, rowing into position, while the Greeks, unaware of the trap closing around them, continued their heated arguments. It was only when Aristides, an exiled Athenian rival of Themistocles who had crossed over from Aegina, arrived with the news that they were surrounded, that the bickering finally stopped. The choice had been made for them. There would be no retreat. There was only the fight. As the sun began to rise over the Saronic Gulf, the scene was one of terrifying majesty. The great king Xerxes had commanded that a golden throne be placed on the slopes of Mount Aigaleos, overlooking the straits. He sat there, surrounded by his scribes and his guard, ready to watch his subjects crush the insolent rebels. Below him, the sea was carpeted with ships. The Persian fleet was a multi-ethnic armada, featuring the finest sailors of the ancient world. There were Phoenicians from the cities of Tyre and Sidon, veteran mariners who had traded across the known world. There were Egyptians, Ionians, and Carians, all bound to the service of the King of Kings. Against them stood the Greeks. They were fewer in number, perhaps 380 ships against a Persian force that still numbered over 600 despite earlier losses to storms. But the Greeks had the advantage of the terrain. The Straits of Salamis were narrow and treacherous, a bottleneck that would prevent the Persians from utilizing their full weight. The trireme, the primary weapon of this naval age, was a marvel of engineering. It was a long, slender vessel powered by 170 oarsmen, designed for one purpose: to act as a maritime battering ram. The battle began with a trumpet blast that echoed off the rocky shores. We are told that the Greeks initially backed water, hesitating as the massive Persian lines surged forward. But then, an Athenian ship leaped ahead, its bronze ram smashing into the side of a Phoenician vessel. The silence of the morning was shattered by the sound of splintering timber and the screams of men. The chaos of Salamis had begun. The decision to abandon the city had not been an easy one. It was born from one of the most famous and cryptic moments in the history of the ancient world. Months earlier, as the Persian juggernaut began its slow, inevitable crawl toward the Greek heartlands, the Athenians had sent envoys to the oracle at Delphi. They sought guidance from the Pythia, the priestess who spoke for Apollo himself. Her first response was a terrifying vision of absolute doom. She told them to flee to the ends of the earth, for nothing would be left standing, neither head nor body, nor feet nor hands. It was a prophecy of total annihilation. However, the Athenians begged for a second word, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. It was then that the oracle spoke the words that would change the course of history. She told them that while all else would be taken, Zeus the all-seeing would grant that the wooden wall only should not fall, but help the Athenians and their children. To many in Athens, this was a literal instruction to fortify the wooden palisade around the Acropolis. But there was one man who saw a different truth. Themistocles, the populist leader and naval visionary, argued that the wooden walls were not fences or fortifications. They were the triremes. He insisted that the salvation of Greece lay not on the land, but on the water. Now, as they watched their city burn from across the narrow straits, that prophecy was being put to the ultimate test. The situation was desperate. The Greek fleet was a fragile coalition of city-states, many of whom were on the verge of splintering. While the Athenians provided the largest contingent of ships, the overall command was held by a Spartan, the Admiral Eurybides. This was a necessary political concession. The other Peloponnesian states, like Corinth and Aegina, would never have agreed to serve under an Athenian commander. Yet, the tension between these leaders was at a breaking point. The Spartans and the Corinthians wanted to retreat. Their eyes were fixed firmly on the Peloponnese. They argued that the fleet should move to the Isthmus of Corinth, where a massive wall was being constructed to block the land approach to their southern sanctuary. They believed that if they were defeated at Salamis, they would be trapped and besieged on a small island. At the isthmus, they felt they had a chance to defend their own homes. Themistocles, however, knew that if the fleet retreated to the isthmus, it would simply dissolve. The various contingents would sail away to protect their own individual cities, and the Greek cause would be lost. The debates in the Greek camp were as fierce as any battle. We are told of a moment when the Corinthian commander, Adimantus, insulted Themistocles, reminding him that he was a man without a city, a refugee from a burned-out shell. Themistocles retorted that as long as he had 200 ships fully manned, he had a city greater than any in Greece. He even threatened that if the allies abandoned Salamis, the Athenians would pack up their families and sail away to Italy to found a new colony, leaving the Peloponnesians to face the Persian navy alone. It was a high-stakes game of political brinkmanship. But even with his threats, Themistocles knew he could not hold the coalition together by words alone. He needed to force a battle. He needed to trap the Greeks into fighting, and he needed to trap the Persians into a location where their superior numbers would become a liability. In the dead of night, he sent a trusted slave named Sisinus across the water to the Persian camp. Sisinus carried a message for Xerxes himself. The message claimed that Themistocles had changed sides and that the Greeks were in a state of blind panic, planning to flee under the cover of darkness. If Xerxes attacked now, he would catch them in total disarray and end the war in a single stroke. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Xerxes, sitting in his opulent camp, was eager for a final victory. He had been delayed at Thermopylae, and he knew that the sailing season was drawing to a close. He could not afford a long, drawn-out blockade. He believed the message. He ordered his fleet to move immediately. Blocking the exits of the straits, and sentries were posted to watch for any escaping Greek vessels. Throughout the night, the Persian sailors labored at their oars, rowing into position, while the Greeks, unaware of the trap closing around them, continued their heated arguments. It was only when Aristides, an exiled Athenian rival of Themistocles who had crossed over from Aegina, arrived with the news that they were surrounded, that the bickering finally stopped. The choice had been made for them. There would be no retreat. There was only the fight. As the sun began to rise over the Saronic Gulf, the scene was one of terrifying majesty. The great king Xerxes had commanded that a golden throne be placed on the slopes of Mount Aigaleos, overlooking the straits. He sat there, surrounded by his scribes and his guard, ready to watch his subjects crush the insolent rebels. Below him, the sea was carpeted with ships. The Persian fleet was a multi-ethnic armada, featuring the finest sailors of the ancient world. There were Phoenicians from the cities of Tyre and Sidon, veteran mariners who had traded across the known world. There were Egyptians, Ionians, and Carians, all bound to the service of the King of Kings. Against them stood the Greeks. They were fewer in number, perhaps 380 ships against a Persian force that still numbered over 600 despite earlier losses to storms. But the Greeks had the advantage of the terrain. The Straits of Salamis were narrow and treacherous, a bottleneck that would prevent the Persians from utilizing their full weight. The trireme, the primary weapon of this naval age, was a marvel of engineering. It was a long, slender vessel powered by 170 oarsmen, designed for one purpose: to act as a maritime battering ram. The battle began with a trumpet blast that echoed off the rocky shores. We are told that the Greeks initially backed water, hesitating as the massive Persian lines surged forward. But then, an Athenian ship leaped ahead, its bronze ram smashing into the side of a Phoenician vessel. The silence of the morning was shattered by the sound of splintering timber and the screams of men. The chaos of Salamis had begun. In the narrow confines of the strait, the Persian numbers quickly turned from an asset into a curse. The forward lines, under the watchful eye of the king, were eager to prove their bravery. They pushed forward with such intensity that they began to collide with their own ships that were trying to maneuver. The Phoenicians on the Persian right flank found themselves jammed together, unable to turn or find the speed needed for an effective ramming strike. The Athenians, fighting with the desperation of men whose homes were already lost, expertly worked their way into the gaps, shearing off oars and punching holes in the vulnerable hulls of the Persian ships. The water became a swirling graveyard of wood, wreckage, and drowning men. Unlike the Greeks, many of whom were skilled swimmers, many of the Persian subjects hailed from inland regions and had never learned to stay afloat. They perished by the thousands in the cold Aegean waters. From his throne on the hillside, Xerxes watched in mounting fury as his vaunted navy began to disintegrate. One story from the battle stands out, recorded by Herodotus with a touch of irony. Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus and a commander in the Persian fleet, found herself pursued by an Athenian ship. Seeing no way out and with her path blocked by her own allies, she turned her ram against a Persian ship belonging to the Calindians. The Athenian captain, seeing her sink a ship on the Persian side, assumed she had defected and gave up the chase. Xerxes, watching from above, believed she had destroyed a Greek vessel and famously remarked that his men had become women and his women had become men. But Artemisia's cunning was a rare bright spot for the invaders. By midday, the Persian line was broken. The elite Phoenician squadron had been decimated, and the Persian commanders were falling in quick succession. Ariobanes, the brother of Xerxes and the admiral of the fleet, was among the first to die, his body lost in the churning surf. The Greeks, led by the Athenians and the formidable sailors of Aegina, moved in for the kill. They hunted down the retreating Persian ships, ramming them as they tried to flee the narrow waters. As the sun began to set, the scale of the Greek victory became clear. The Persian navy, the largest and most powerful force on earth, had been soundly defeated by a coalition of states that had spent most of their history fighting one another. Xerxes was shaken. He had witnessed the destruction of his maritime power, and with it, the security of his supply lines. If the Greeks were to sail north and destroy the pontoon bridges he had built across the Hellespont, he and his entire army would be trapped in Europe. The aftermath of Salamis was a turning point of such magnitude that its ripples are still felt today. Xerxes, fearing for his own safety, decided to retreat to Asia with the bulk of his surviving forces. He left behind a large land army under his general Mardonius to finish the conquest, but the aura of Persian invincibility had been shattered. The wooden walls had held. Themistocles, the man who had seen the truth in the oracle's words, was the hero of the hour. Even the Spartans, usually so stingy with their praise for foreigners, honored him with a crown of olive and the gift of a magnificent chariot. Yet, as the smoke cleared from the waters of Salamis, the Greeks knew that the danger had not passed. Mardonius still held the north, and his army was still a formidable machine of war. The struggle for the soul of Greece would move from the sea back to the land, where the spears of the Spartans would be called upon once more. But for one day, in a narrow channel of water between an island and a burning city, the course of Western civilization had been decided by the rhythm of the oars and the strength of the wooden walls. We will continue the story of this epic struggle in the next segment. The year was 479 BC. In the wake of the miraculous naval victory at Salamis, the immediate threat to the Greek heartlands had seemingly receded with the departure of the great King Xerxes. The shadow of the Persian colossus, however, still loomed large over the northern horizon. While the King of Kings had fled back to the safety of Asia Minor, fearing for his bridges across the Hellespont, he had not left the Greek world empty-handed. Behind him, in the fertile plains of Thessaly, remained a massive and battle-hardened land force, a coalition of the empire's finest. At its head stood Mardonius, the king's cousin and a veteran of the Thracian campaigns, a man whose ambition was matched only by his tactical cunning. For the Greeks, the war was far from over. If Thermopylae had been a sacrifice and Salamis a desperate bid for survival, the coming struggle would be the final judgment. It would be at Plataea, on the rolling foothills of Mount Cithaeron, that the destiny of the Western world would be decided once and for all. As winter gave way to spring, the atmosphere in the Greek camp was one of fracturing unity. The Athenians, having seen their city burned twice by the invaders, were growing increasingly impatient with their Peloponnesian allies. From their perspective, The Spartans were once again dragging their heels, preferring to shelter behind the newly constructed wall at the Isthmus of Corinth rather than marching north to liberate the rest of Greece. Mardonius, well aware of these internal tensions, attempted to play the diplomat, offering the Athenians a separate peace, complete with the restoration of their lands and Persian funding for the rebuilding of their temples. It was a tempting offer for a people who had lost almost everything. Yet, in a display of remarkable resolve, the Athenians refused, their ambassadors informing the Spartans that they would continue the fight, but only if Sparta finally committed her full strength to the field. The decision to finally march was spurred by a warning from Chilios of Tegea, a respected ally of the Spartans. He made it clear to the 5 ephors, the powerful overseers of the Spartan state, that if the Athenian navy joined the Persian side out of frustration, even the strongest wall at the isthmus would be useless against a sea-borne invasion of the Peloponnese. Realizing the existential threat, the Spartans moved with uncharacteristic speed. In the dead of night, 5,000 Spartiates, each accompanied by 7 Helot light troops, began their march north. It was the largest force of fully fledged Spartan citizens ever to leave the city at once. Joined by an additional 5,000 perioi koi from the surrounding towns of Laconia, the Spartan contingent alone numbered 10,000 hoplites. By the time they reached the isthmus and joined with the Athenians, the Corinthians, and other allies, the Greek army had swelled to a size never before seen in their history, a Panhellenic host of some 100,000 men. Leading this massive coalition was Pausanias. As the nephew of the fallen king Leonidas and regent for the young prince Pleistarchus, the weight of his ancestors' legacy sat heavily upon his shoulders. He was a man of high birth and even higher ambition, tasked with managing a temperamental alliance of city-states that spent as much time arguing with one another as they did preparing for battle. As the Greek army descended from the passes of Mount Cithaeron, they looked down upon the Boeotian plain where Mardonius had prepared his ground. The Persian general had razed the city of Plataea and constructed a massive fortified camp, a wooden fortress designed to serve as a secure base for his multi-ethnic army. Here, on the banks of the Asopus River, the two worlds faced one another in a tense and agonizing standoff. For 11 days, neither side was willing to commit to a full frontal assault. Mardonius, with his superior cavalry, held the advantage in the open plains, while Pausanias kept his hoplites on the higher, rugged ground where the Persian horsemen could not easily maneuver. The heat of the midsummer sun beat down upon the soldiers as they waited. A psychological war of nerves played out across the river. Persian outriders, led by the charismatic commander Mecistius, harassed the Greek lines, cutting off supply wagons and poisoning the springs that provided the Greeks with water. In one particularly fierce skirmish, the Megarians were nearly overwhelmed by Persian archers and cavalry. It was only the intervention of the Athenian archers and a group of hoplites that turned the tide. During the chaos, Mecistius himself was unhorsed. His heavy scale armor, worn beneath a purple tunic, initially protected him from the Greek spears, but he was eventually killed by a thrust to the eye. The death of such a high-ranking noble sent the Persian camp into a deep and ritualized mourning, with the soldiers cutting their own hair and the manes of their horses as a sign of grief. Despite this small victory, the Greek position was becoming untenable. Deprived of water and under constant harassment, Pausanias made the difficult decision to conduct a night retreat to a more defensible position known as the island, a piece of land surrounded by 2 branches of the Oro River. However, the retreat did not go as planned. In the darkness, communication broke down. Some contingents lost their way, while others, out of fear or confusion, marched further back than intended. At the center of this chaos was a Spartan officer named Amompharetus. In a display of typical Spartan stubbornness, he refused to retreat, claiming that his laws forbade him from ever turning his back on the enemy. Pausanias spent the precious hours before dawn arguing with his subordinate, while the Athenians, unaware of the delay, began their own movement. By the time the sun rose, the Greek line was fragmented and exposed. When Mardonius looked out from his camp at dawn and saw the Greek positions empty, he believed the alliance had finally shattered. Seeing the Spartans and Tegeans isolated on the slopes, he ordered a general advance. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The Persian infantry, protected by large wicker shields called sparas, moved forward in a massive, shimmering wave. They planted their shields in the ground and began to unleash a relentless storm of arrows upon the Spartan ranks. For Pausanias, the situation was critical. Under a hail of missiles, his men remained stationary, crouched behind their shields. The omens from the animal sacrifices were unfavorable, and as a deeply religious man, Pausanias refused to order the charge until the gods gave their consent. The Spartans and Tegeans stood firm as their comrades fell around them. It is said that Pausanias, in a moment of extreme pressure, looked toward the nearby temple of Hera and prayed for the goddess to intervene. Almost immediately, the omens changed. The Tegeans, unable to contain their fury any longer, were the first to surge forward, followed closely by the Spartan phalanx. The transition from static defense to an aggressive charge was sudden and terrifying. As the Greeks closed the distance, the Persian archers dropped their bows and reached for their short swords and daggers, but they were no match for the reach of the Greek dory. The clash was one of pure, unadulterated physicality. The Spartan phalanx, a wall of bronze and muscle, slammed into the Persian line with the force of a tidal wave. The wicker shields of the Persians were easily splintered by the heavy spears of the hoplites. In reality, the Persians were not lacking in courage. Herodotus records that they fought with immense bravery, often grabbing the Greek spears with their bare hands in a desperate attempt to break them. But courage was not enough to overcome the technical superiority of the Greek equipment. The hoplite was a heavy infantryman designed for exactly this kind of close-quarters grinding. His large circular shield, the aspis, protected not just himself but the man to his left, creating an impenetrable front. At the heart of the fray, Mardonius himself led the charge, riding a magnificent white horse and surrounded by 1,000 elite guards. He was the soul of the Persian effort, and as long as he remained on the field, the Persians held their ground. However, the tide turned when a Spartan named Eumnestus spotted the Persian general. With a powerful throw of a stone or a spear, he struck Mardonius, killing him instantly. With their leader dead, the Persian resolve crumbled. What had been a disciplined line transformed into a panicked rout. The Persians fled back toward their wooden fortress, pursued by the vengeful Greeks. While the Spartans and Tegeans were breaking the main Persian force, the Athenians on the other wing were engaged in a bitter struggle of their own. They were not fighting Persians, but fellow Greeks. The Thebans, who had mazed and joined the invaders, fought with a desperate ferocity, knowing that there would be no mercy for them if they lost. It was a civil war within a world war, a brutal reminder of the deep divisions that still plagued the Hellenic people. Eventually, the Athenians prevailed, forcing the Thebans to retreat back toward their city walls. The final act of the battle took place at the Persian camp. The wooden walls, which had seemed so formidable, were eventually breached by the Tegeans and Spartans. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Persians, trapped within their own fortifications, were cut down in their thousands. Of the massive army that Mardonius had led into Boeotia, only a fraction escaped, led by the general Artabazus, who had wisely kept his own contingent out of the final disaster and began a hurried retreat back toward the Hellespont. In the aftermath of the carnage, the Greeks found themselves masters of a field littered with the riches of an empire. The tent of Mardonius was filled with gold and silver furniture, ornate tapestries, and precious vessels. Pausanias, in a moment of calculated reflection, ordered the Persian cooks to prepare a grand banquet in the royal style, while his own servants prepared a simple Spartan meal. He invited his fellow commanders to look at the two tables, marveling at the folly of a man who possessed such luxury yet came to rob the Greeks of their poverty. The victory at Plataea was the final, decisive blow to the Persian ambitions in mainland Greece. Combined with a naval victory at Mycale on the very same day, the threat of subjugation was ended. To commemorate their triumph, the Greeks dedicated a magnificent bronze monument at Delphi, the Serpent Column, which recorded the names of all the city-states that had stood together against the invader. Even today, the base of that column remains in the Hippodrome of Istanbul, a silent witness to a time when a divided people found common cause. But for Sparta, the victory was bittersweet. Though they had proven themselves once again to be the preeminent warriors of the Greek world, the war had changed everything. The rise of Athenian naval power and the prestige they gained from the conflict began to sow the seeds of a new and even more destructive rivalry. The Spartan state, geared entirely for war and the suppression of its own slave population, would soon find itself struggling to adapt to a world where their old enemies were now their most dangerous competitors. The judgment at Plataea had saved Greece, but it had also birthed a new era of conflict. The story of the Greco-Persian Wars is not just one of heroic stands and grand battles, but a complex narrative of shifting loyalties and the birth of a collective identity that would define Western civilization. As we look back across the centuries at the silent fields of Boeotia, we see more than just the site of an ancient battle. We see the proving ground of the phalanx and the moment when the Spartan wolf pack reached its zenith. I am your host, Pete Kelly, and you have been watching History Time. Our journey through the epic struggles of the ancient world is far from over. In our next segment, we will explore the fallout of this great victory and the beginning of the golden age that would eventually lead to the tragic downfall of the very heroes we have discussed today. Do not forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on our latest documentaries. I will see you next time.